I guess we'll just start with the TV series.
ABC was not successful with its soap operas. Soap operas used to be a big thing in the broadcasting schedule because and they had like 18 soap operas on at one time. Now, of course, they're practically all gone. But the food and household goods companies, which are big companies, they wanted to advertise directly to housewives. So the soap operas were pretty lucrative for the networks, but ABC didn't seem to have any success until Dark Shadows. And Dark Shadows started in, I think it was June of 1966, started in black and white. All the soap operas were in black and white at that time. And for the first 9 months, it was in danger of being canceled. Got bad reviews, didn't do well in the ratings. And when they got the word, when Dan Curtis, who was the producer and the creator of the show, when he got the word they were being canceled, they knew they had only a few weeks to try to do something to pick up the ratings. And he had always wanted to do a vampire story of some kind, a movie or whatever. So he asked his writers to introduce a vampire character.
Oh, would you like to wait in the drawing room?
Here would be fine, thank you.
Oh, well, I'll let Mrs. Starbuck know you're here.
Oh, madam, if you would, you may tell her that it's Barnabas Collins.
And Barnabas Collins came into the show, and the ratings began to pick up from that point. It took off. So Barnabas Collins proved his value. And originally he was supposed to be a vampire character who would be a villain and would be killed off after a few weeks. But Barnabas Collins became a sensation. There was times there when Barnabas Collins and Dark Shadows had the same sort of wild fan appeal that the Beatles had almost.
Right, yeah.
Not quite on that level, of course, because nobody ever reached quite that level, but I think I sent you some articles about near riots that broke out during public appearances of Jonathan Frid, the guy who played Barnabas Collins. Overwhelming crowds, they weren't prepared, and havoc ensued. It wasn't anything that caused injury or loss of life. Still, the fact that a character from a soap opera would get that sort of reaction. And I was just listening yesterday to, Dick Cavett, right? He was talk show host for many years. And he had Jonathan Frid on. Apparently only the audio portion of the show survives. But to listen to the show, to his interview of Jonathan Frid, again, it almost feels like he's interviewing a Beatle.
You all know my dear friend Barnabas, don't you? We'll see. Go, man.
There are mostly young people in the audience, and they're all just sort of practically squealing with delight,
That seems kind of odd because he doesn't. Yeah. He's like a really weird. He's not the handsome Dracula that you're used to seeing, and
some middle-aged guy with a very unusual facial structure and a very weird haircut. And but I
kind of reminded me of Patrick Troughton from Doctor Who.
Yeah, it did have a little bit of that. So, yeah, but him and Grayson Hall, who played Dr. Julia Hoffman on the show, was really, I suppose you could say, the other major character on the show. She had a very unusual facial structure too. And this might be the reason why the show was so interesting to people. Usually they tune in soap operas and it was all these sort of bland, boring, pretty people. At this show, you got these really strange looking folks with very sharp cheekbones and angular faces. And they looked like they had a lot of gravitas. They like something important was happening when you saw them on the screen. Jonathan Frid hadn't done any major roles in movies or television. And he took this part, which they thought, the folks that were writing the show, was just going to be a quick, maybe a few weeks, and then he'd be gone. They didn't really want somebody who brought sort of the Bela Lugosi vampire to mind. They were thinking more along the lines of a prettier, younger guy, I guess, to appeal to a soap opera audience. But they got, for some reason, they ended up with Frid. He's one of the people that auditioned. And I guess he just fit the part so well. He just looked like a vampire, There's some discussion as to whether or not he was the first reluctant vampire or the first vampire with a conscience. I don't think that's quite right. I think that some of the ideas that they have in talk shows about Barnabas Collins came from some of those Universal films like House of Dracula, a similar type of thing with Dracula, not perhaps being somebody with a conscience or somebody who feels guilty, but he approaches a doctor to see if he can be cured.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of the Wolfman. Yeah, that was his whole thing of being cured.
But in House of Dracula, it's actually Dracula who seeks out a doctor to see if he can be cured of his vampirism. And in Daughter of Dracula, or Dracula's Daughter, which was a direct sequel to the 1931 Dracula, Dracula's Daughter is also conflicted about being a vampire. And she wants to be cured, and she goes to a psychiatrist. And that's really the whole plot of the movie, is her quest to be cured of her vampirism. So it really wasn't a new idea. And even in Dark Shadows, he doesn't start out that way. He starts out as a pretty straightforward villain. He wants to, put the bite on as many women as he can. And it was the way Jonathan Frid played the part, because apparently Jonathan Frid had that one idea that I'm going to play this guy so that people can sympathize with him. He wanted to make a character that would be more than just a one-dimensional villain, which is certainly to his credit. And the writers started to pick up on that, and the audience certainly started to pick up on that. And so the character began to move in that direction. It's the sort of thing that happens on soap operas fairly frequently.
Yeah.
The person who is a mad rapist in the first season, a few years along, he's everybody's ideal.
Yeah.
But just to describe the basic setup, it's a very wealthy family in a New England town of Collinsport. And they're all very wealthy from the fishing industry. That's their thing. And the matriarch, the head of the family, is a woman who, in the beginning of the soap opera, has not left Collinwood and not left her home in 10 years or some long number of years, because she believed she had killed her husband and he was buried in the basement. So she wanted to stay in the house, I guess out of fear that if she left, somebody might discover his body. Anyway, that's a story that was playing out before Barnabas arrived.
Yeah.
Just as Barnabas was coming into the story, they resolved that. And what was actually one of the best episodes of the series, the only time in the show that I ever saw them actually give a satisfying resolution to one of the plot lines.
I know.
Liz?
No, I can't.
Leave her alone. Wait. Elizabeth, what is it?
I killed Paul Stoddard, and that man was my accomplice.
So this family, they have all their little personal conflicts and scandals and things like that. And that was pretty much the way the show was for the first 9 months, like a romance novel type material.
Yeah.
Dan Curtis said he got the idea in a dream. I don't know if this is just his way of sort of hyping it. But his original idea was he had this vision of a woman traveling in a train to this place, where she's going to be a governess for a wealthy family.
My name is Victoria Winters. My journey is beginning. A journey that I hope will open the doors of life to me and link my past with my future. A journey that will bring me to a strange and dark place, to the edge of the sea, high atop Widow's Hill, a house called Collinwood.
That was his original idea. He handed it off to one of his writers. But Dan Curtis was originally a guy who did sports programming on TV. I don't think he had any background in doing TV dramas, but he had this idea. He was able to sell the idea, and they developed it to be recognizable to housewives as sort of romance novel type material. She's there taking care of this small boy, David Collins, and he's a sort of a troubled kid.
You know what that girl should have done? Should have gotten all those people, lined them up against a wall, and then pow, pow, pow.
Anyway, none of that really seemed to stick with the audience. Everybody seemed to find it pretty boring. And then they had this idea of bringing in the vampire.
Where are you? What are you waiting for? Come in. Close the door.
Willie Loomis, who was played on the series by John Collin, who would later go on to win an Emmy playing the husband of Cagney or Lacey in the Cagney and Lacey TV show, which was a big hit in the 80s. And he was quite a good actor. There were a couple other. Grayson Hall was certainly an interesting actor.
Roger, no. No, I wish it were Roger.
Miss Hoffman!
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's just, I just had to know. Oh.
She had actually been nominated. I don't know if she won. She was nominated for an Oscar for her role in Night of the Iguana, which was a film adaptation of a Tennessee Williams play with Richard Burton. It was done by John Huston.
My brother has been in communication with Blake's tours, and they've assured him that they will take action, drastic action.
Just what do you mean by that? I have a contract that provides...
Your contract is worthless. My brother is a judge, and he has informed your employer that they are not required to employ a man who makes a career of seducing young girls.
Seducing?
It's a pretty big film. She had a pretty important role in it. Jonathan Fred was somebody who seemed to have a lot of difficulty with his dialogue. The other actors and the fans came to refer to his little verbal missteps as Fred speak. And sometimes it's delightful to hear what he comes up with when he can't remember the line and he can't find some motivation to look at the teleprompter.
Yeah. I can't be sure of anything, Junior. I can't even be sure of the experiment itself. If we fail, well, then we must go through with it anyway.
It's absolutely out of the question.
Why?
Well, because if you were to conduct the experiment, how could I fit into that? You would be giving the life force.
Have you?
Yes, it's reassuring to know that there's still part of the family still alive in England. Tomorrow evening will be an occasion long remembered. That night must go with nothing wrong.
He gets this sort of panicked expression, and I think that that had a lot to do with the success of the character, because he was playing a character who had secrets. He was playing a character who had good reason to be nervous, and Fred himself had secrets. He was a closeted gay man. He never came out of the closet, actually died still in the closet. And he was playing this character that was supposed to be a romantic lead, you know, making vampire love to all the ladies. And of course, when he became sort of the sensation, the first question that came up is, what are your romantic interests? Are you, you know, involved with any of the actresses on the show and that sort of thing? That must have made him very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But all of that discomfort led to creating this character, unintentionally perhaps, who just seemed so tentative and filled with fear. And it was kind of an interesting twist, because that's not the way Christopher Lee was playing Dracula at the time.
Right.
Christopher Lee Dracula was the other major vampire character around at that time, and it was just completely the opposite, right? Dracula was, you know, Christopher Lee's Dracula was a force of nature. He wasn't nervous or, you know, reluctant in any way. But that feel of uncertainty and being uncomfortable made him attractive to all the misfits in the United States. All the young kids that were growing up, or maybe had questions about their sexual orientation, or kids that just were being bullied at school and didn't feel like they fit in. There was a guy who actually had supernatural powers, and he looked just as uncomfortable and just as nervous as they felt. You know? So I think at that point there was, because there's one thing we have to say about Dark Shadows, the whole phenomenon. It went on. There was the original soap opera that went from 66 to 71, I believe. There were the two feature films that were released by MGM that were done in 71 and 72 or something like that. And in the 90s, there was a primetime TV version with Ben Cross, the Chariots of Fire actor, playing Barnabas Collins. And that only lasted a season because it was frequently preempted by coverage of the Gulf War. So that was another incarnation. And in 2004, they did a pilot that apparently for the CW, was it CW or the W? What are we calling it?
Probably the WB at that time.
It was 2004. Yeah, maybe it was WB. Anyway, they disliked it so much that they didn't even air it. And the only way you can see that now is a bootleg copy that's on YouTube. And then finally, we had the Tim Burton movie. So this is something that's gone on and on and on for years. And if you look on Facebook, you see any number of groups and pages devoted to it. The fans are just as fervent about their love for the show as they ever have been. Tubi TV and Pluto TV are running all the episodes now. The show has been in syndication for, I think, since the 80s at least. And you say to yourself, how is it possible that something where there's never been a good version, there's never been, there's not a single episode of the soap opera that you could point to and say, that is a great TV. Just didn't happen. I mean, it was a soap opera, it was being shot quickly. They often, the actors didn't know their lines because the scripts had just been handed to them practically before they went on the air. It was done live on tape, and there was very minimal editing because there wasn't any, they hadn't developed the technology to edit videotape at that point. The only way you could edit videotape was to take out the scissors.
Yeah.
And that wasn't desirable. So everything pretty much that happened when they were recording those shows went out to the world. And it's quite an extraordinary experience to watch those shows, because sometimes some really bad things happen. Like there was one instance where there was actually a fire in the studio behind them. And it was Jonathan Frid and the woman who plays Victoria Winters in her show, Alexandria Mulca, I think her name was. Anyway, they're in like a two-shot, and they're talking to each other. And in the background, you start to hear people moving around, and then you hear the sound of fire extinguishers.
You should let it become quite ordinary.
Do you mean that I should let it become even more familiar?
Well, doesn't that make sense?
Yes. I guess it does.
but then try it and see. And if after a while that you're still disturbed by it, then I'll take it back. And please, don't be afraid of what being trapped by the past means. After all, one should be afraid of being trapped by the present.
And to their credit, the two actors went through their scene and they slowed down a little bit, but they went through the scene and they never stopped. Nobody ever said, cut. And that's the way it went out.
Yeah.
Sometimes, because they had the cameras, they were big cameras and they were mounted on dollies that would move around. And sometimes those cameras would just wheel themselves right into a shot. So you'd be watching, you'd be in the old house and there's the camera coming in on the side.
Was there. She has reason now to move it.
What do you mean?
She came into the room while I was still there.
And of course, the boom mics were a constant presence in the show. They were almost like another character in the show. And all of that stuff just went out on the air. Part of it, part of the success of the show might be that feeling that you're watching something that's live. It's like almost like watching theater.
Yeah.
They also made matters worse for themselves by incorporating an extraordinary amount of special effects. And they started with basic superimpositions, which is a fairly easy thing to do, even with the video equipment they were using. They did things like bats. They had a puppeteer who I think might have been the puppeteer who did the puppets for that scene, the marionette scene in The Sound of Music. I don't know if you've ever seen The Sound of Music. Anyway, they brought in a marionette puppeteer to create their bat effects. Didn't really help. The bat effects were pretty cheesy.
Get away from me! No! Get away from me!
They had like a lot of chroma key work, and they must have been doing it right when chroma key was being developed, and it would frequently went wrong.
Yeah.
But you have to admire that. You see, here's a show that's being done 5 days a week, and it's going out pretty much live. I mean, whatever they're recording is what's going to go out, and they're willing to go so far as to actually do chroma key effects and bats on strings and things like that, and stunt work. When they introduced a werewolf character, they had a fair amount of stunt work with him jumping through windows and stuff like that. So it's a very ambitious show in production terms. And that you have to admire that. One ratings peak that they hit came during the time when they had a sort of time travel episode where the whole thing went back. Two of the characters ended up going back to 1897, I think. And so the whole show was done in 1890s type clothing, and it was a big success in the ratings, and they tried doing that several times more over the years to diminishing results. But I admired their ambition, and I admired the fact that they were willing to try things like that. But there's really no episode that you could point to and say, that's perfect. When the show was finally announced as being canceled, they did a strange thing, and I still don't know why they did this. They had this story, this ongoing story of Barnabas and Dr. Hoffman and all the regular characters that they wanted to resolve because they knew the show was going to be ending. So they came up with an episode where they resolved all the major storylines with those characters. And then the show went on for another couple of weeks. And the characters that they played in the remaining weeks of the show were different characters. And I can't help but wonder what the reaction of the fans must have been to see the show still on 5 days, every week, and to have the story be completely different and all the characters be different characters. It must have been maddening. But maybe at that point they'd given up hope. So,
yeah.
But I thought they overdid the time travel stuff, and I think that's a mistake. I think that the first time you do something like that, it's very refreshing, and you get to see the show in a different perspective. But it becomes a crutch when you get the feeling that The writers that just want to abandon the plot that they've developed. They just want to escape from that plot, and they're going back in time to get away from the mess they've made of the plot in the present day. I always felt that the strongest story that they had was Barnabas and Dr. Hoffman and 2 or 3 of the other characters sort of dealing with other supernatural phenomena that was happening around them. And in a way, you could see Barnabas and Julia as kind of an early version of Mulder and Scully, with the added advantage that in this case, Mulder actually is a supernatural creature himself. But when they got started with the story, probably the most dramatically intriguing ideas are the ideas that they ended up incorporating into House of Dark Shadows, which was the first feature film that they did. They actually did that while the soap opera was still on the air. They wrote certain characters out of the soap opera for the time that it was necessary to shoot the movie. And other characters, the plot followed other characters while they were away. And they shot it all on location. At least the vast majority of it was shot on location. And I guess we can talk about House of Dark Shadows, but just to finish up with the soap opera, the frustration and the delight, I guess, of anybody who watches soap operas, and I never did. Dark Shadows is the only soap opera I ever paid any attention to. The frustration and the delight is that you know that you're never really going to get any sort of satisfactory resolution to the story. But with Dark Shadows, they really pushed their luck.
Yeah.
Because they were taking a very long way developing some sometimes fairly tedious stories, like they had a whole period there where they had like a Frankenstein plotline. And that verged on tedium because they kept doing the same thing. The Frankenstein monster would abduct one or another female members of the Collinwood household and keep them someplace for a while. And he was tied somehow to some sort of nonsensical supernatural thing. The monster was tied to Barnabas Collins in some way. Anyway, that story seemed to go on forever. And then they got tired of it, or they saw that the ratings were going down. So they just went, they said, we'll put the Frankenstein monster in the closet and we'll just forget the effort. And that's very frustrating, I think, to audiences. And I could see why over time, that, particularly when you start doing time travel, where you have a whole bunch of plots that aren't, they're in the past, it just becomes too confusing. And you start thinking, what's the point of all this? Where are we going with this?
Yeah.
And that I think was its downfall. There are some people that believe that the release of the feature film might have affected the ratings of the TV show. I think there's a certain logic to that. I know in the past, there were other feature films based on TV shows, like the 1966 Batman TV series had a Batman theatrical film. And I think what happens is when people go to see something like that, if they do, they really feel that now they've had enough. And so the idea of going back and watching the TV show, which is more and more and more and more the same, just doesn't appeal to them anymore.
Yeah, same thing happened to me with X-Files. After the X-Files movie,
yes.
I never watched the show, and The Simpsons. I watched the movie, and I was like, all right, I'm done.
You feel like you've fulfilled your obligation to the show.
Yeah.
And also, sometimes when these things that we love so much are put on the big screen, we begin to see that, oh, really, they are just TV shows. They're really not meant for the big screen. X-Files is a good example. I still remember seeing the X-Files, the first film, in a very crowded theater on the weekend it premiered. And you could tell the audience was just filled with anticipation. This was going to be great,
Yeah.
Right? Because the TV show, very often people would say the TV show was like a feature film every week. It had that sort of level of production value, and it was that intense and exciting and wonderful. So surely the movie is going to be 10 times that. And it wasn't. It wasn't even a particularly good episode of the TV show.
Yeah.
It wasn't even up to that level. So House of Dark Shadows also had another problem, which was you get the feeling that Dan Curtis was starting to tire of the grind of the soap opera. He wanted to establish himself as a film director and producer. And so he was keen on making a movie that would, first of all, be as gory as possible, which it seemed almost certain to offend the mothers that were bringing their children to see.
Yeah.
And also would kill all the characters, Barnabas and Dr. Hoffman and Roger and who else? Willie Loomis, and all of those characters get killed rather bloodily. Perhaps there were mothers who, having a chance to see the movie, they maybe never watched the soap opera, but having a chance to see the movie on the big screen, they said, I don't want my kids watching this. And so they took them away from the TV. But it also could simply be that people had had enough at that point.
Right, yeah.
Interesting thing is the movie was a success, and so is the sequel. The sequel didn't involve Barnabas Collins, but it had other actors from the Dark Shadows soap opera. It was a reasonable success. Anyway, that's the soap opera.
I think if you were going to try to sell this show now to a younger person, say, hey, you should watch this, and you say soap opera, they're going to say no.
Yeah, it's a tough sell. I mean, it's a particular I think the audience for Dark Shadows, and I'm in this group myself because I'm a misfit, an odd creature, but you probably have a much easier time selling it to that demographic. People who might be on the spectrum, or people who are just the odd man out or the odd woman out. They take to this show because it's a type of fantasy that they particularly like. They have a special affinity for these type of characters. And I think it's probably because they all seem so fraught with anxiety and fear and uncertainty about everything. I mean, the woman who played Elizabeth Stoddard Collins, now she has that Stoddard because she's the head of the Collins household, but she married a guy whose name was Stoddard, and he's the guy that she supposedly bumped off.
Yeah.
It turns out that she wasn't a murderer, and that's why she continues to be a character in the story for the next, right up until the end of the run. And she was she was in House of Dark Shadows as well. She was played by Joan Bennett, and Joan Bennett was a major star in her day. She started working in movies in the 1920s, and she was a major star. She did a lot of movies for Fritz Lang, and she was a big Hollywood star, and she's very pretty, very and reasonably talented, talented professional actor, and then she had a scandal. Her husband, whose name was Walter Wanger, he was a producer. He was going through a rough time because his career wasn't going so well. And he began to suspect that his wife, Joan Bennett, was cheating on him with her, I guess it was her agent. So he saw them together in a car, and he approached the guy when he was getting out of the car, and he shot him in the groin, shot him twice, shot him in the hip and in the groin. And the guy didn't die, fortunately. And Walter Wanger threw himself on the mercy of the court. He refused a jury trial and said, right, Your Honor, I thought she was cheating on me and I did it out of anger. And he got a fairly light sentence. He was in prison for a brief time. He got out, he resumed his career, and he went on to be a successful producer for the rest of his life. Funny thing was, Joan Bennett's career suffered because I guess people believed that she might have been cheating on her husband.
Yeah.
So she didn't really work in movies too much after that. She went to theater, and then I guess she did a lot of TV because TV was always looking for, even slightly damaged Hollywood stars. And then she ended up in Dark Shadows, and she technically is the star of Dark Shadows. Now, the reason why I mention him is that idea of the anxious, stressed out people that all seem to inhabit Dark Shadows. Everybody is that way. She had this thing where she would hold her hands like this in front of her. She wasn't doing isometrics. That was a sign of, nervousness, nervous tension. It's like, I'm nervous. What's going to happen next? And Willie Loomis was a wreck.
Yeah, comparing him from the first episode to how he is in the movie, it seemed they laid off that a little bit.
Yeah.
He wasn't he wasn't as crazy in the movie than he was in that first episode.
Yeah, well, in the story that preceded it, he was a villain. He was helping somebody blackmail them, or he was involved in some nefarious business. And then as soon as Barnabas Collins puts the bite on him, he becomes a more sympathetic character because we feel sorry for him, because Barnabas is always beating him with his cane, which is pretty brutal for an afternoon soap opera. Barnabas on the soap in the early days of his appearances on Dark Shadows, he was constantly doing violent things like that. He was either beating Willie with his cane, or he was strangling Dr. Hoffman. It seemed like Dr. Hoffman, whenever she said anything that he didn't like, it was like, the idea in the soap opera, which sort of developed slowly, and I don't think the writers, there was another instance of the actor being ahead of the writers. Grayson Hall seemed to want to play the character as if she was falling in love with Barnabas. And that was a terrific development, because it meant that she could, have jealousy when Barnabas is not interested in her, he's interested. So that was another thing that made the story very intriguing. Also, Barnabas in the soap opera has a conscience. The little boy, David, he keeps seeing, and certain other people keep seeing this little girl in period dress appearing to them and talking to them. And that's Barnabas Collins' beloved sister, who died before he became a vampire. I forget what the details on and on. Anyway, she died as a child, and she's coming back to warn people about Barnabas. And I always thought that all those ideas were very interesting, and it could have made a terrific movie if somebody would have taken those ideas seriously and said, let's take these basic notions and let's structure it in such a way so that everything pays off, everything is tied together, and there's no random stuff, no loose ends. You could have had a very dramatic story. It could have been very powerful. But it never happened in the soap opera, because, as we say, they moved from one story to the other and nothing was ever resolved. And it didn't happen in the movie, because what they did was they went back to the earliest version of Barnabas Collins in the movie. In House of Dark Shadows, they're basically playing him as the sort of bloodthirsty villain that he was in the original soap in the first few months or first year of the soap opera. So it was kind of a shame in a way. I get the impression that when Dan Curtis came up with the idea of doing a movie based on Dark Shadows, first of all, that was a crazy idea. Nobody had ever done that.
Yeah.
There hadn't been any, no soap opera had ever been made into a feature film. Not the way things work. So, but he finally managed to get the funding to do it. MGM decided that they were willing to finance it. And, but it was done on the cheap. And he took on the job of being the director himself. And that may not have been the best idea. I guess we'll move into House of Dark Shadows now. This was a film that I was desperate to see as a child. And the one time when my mother took me to the theater to see it, we got the schedule screwed up, and they were running a children's matinee of Wizard of Oz. So I never got to see the movie when it was in its original run. But all during those years when I was in grammar school, and this is actually a copy of the paperback book, the novelization of House of Dark Shadows, that I still have from my childhood.
Now, is that in script form, or is that actually novelization?
The soap opera established, this is similar to Star Trek, they established a very successful line of paperback books, and this was another entry. I actually have a bunch of them here. There's another one. There's another one, and there's another one. And they did 40 novels during the run of the paperback run originally. And I don't know, they may still be making, somebody might still be making them. Anyway.
Did Marvel ever do a comic?
Marvel didn't. Gold Key.
Gold Key, okay.
Gold Key had the comic rights. There's the comic. Rather poorly done, frankly. The artwork is not on Marvel level.
That matches the show,
though. They had a daily comic strip that ran for years the way comic strips work, it might still be running. I don't know. I don't know
Yeah,
anybody
no.
who actually reads comic strips,
Yeah.
but for some reason they keep publishing them. Anyway, House of Dark Shadows, I didn't see in its original run. I saw years later on TV when they ran it, a CBS late night movie or something like that. It's not a good film.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to say that it's a wonderful film, and I certainly have affection for it, but it has so many strikes against it. First of all, apparently it was very heavily edited by MGM.
Oh yeah, you could. I mean, that's what my biggest problem was the editing. There
Yeah.
were so many hard cuts, and I was just like, man, what's going on here?
It jumps around very subtly, and you can just tell that they just chopped out big chunks of stuff. And it makes, I mean, I've seen some people online saying that they found the story impossible to follow. I don't know if it's quite that bad.
No, well, no, I found it. No, my other question is though, like the beginning of the movie almost resembles the first episode
Yeah.
with Loomis going to look for the jewels or whatever. So,
Yeah,
I mean, so was their idea with this movie was we're going to reboot the series or?
Well, they weren't going to reboot. I think he wanted it to be an end to it. It was sort of like a retelling of what I guess he considered the most interesting, most marketable part of the soap opera. So he wanted to do like the definitive version of that as a feature film. It might have, I think it probably makes a lot of sense because after all, it was the arrival of Barnabas Collins that made the show a hit. So it's a natural thing to assume if you're going to make a movie version, that's the story you have to tell.
Yeah.
Also, no matter how many times in the course of the soap opera Barnabas stopped being a vampire for a while, people in the media always referred to him as a vampire. It was impossible to escape that. And I think that was another aspect of it that scared Jonathan Frid. The crazy behavior of the fans at some of the public appearances and the level of fanaticism about the show may have scared him. And he might have thought, I'm going to be stuck doing this the rest of my life, playing a guy with fangs, and going around with, climbing out of coffins. And like a lot of actors, he had ambitions, which is fine, but he had something about him that came across in that character. If he was smart, I think he would have said, I don't want to play Barnabas Collins for the rest of my life, but continuing to do horror movies and playing these types of characters is fine. He didn't want to do that. He could have easily positioned himself so he could have been right there next to Vincent Price and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and all those guys that had a career playing in those type of movies. He didn't want to do that. He basically retired after the series. I don't know. He supposedly did some one-man shows, but he was always ending up doing things like reading Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, if you're going to do that, why not just do fucking horror movies?
Yeah.
But he was similar in a way to Leonard Nimoy. Leonard Nimoy's character is actually quite similar to Barnabas Collins. He's a very unusual looking fellow. His haircut is kind of the same. And he's somebody who's an outsider, a loner or a misfit. With Leonard Nimoy, it was kind of the same thing, right? I am not Spock. I don't want to play Spock anymore. I want to be a romantic lead. I want to be an action hero or whatever. And nobody wanted to see him doing those things. They wanted to see Spock. They wanted to see Barnabas. It seems to me that if you want to be a successful actor and have a long career, Leonard Nimoy figured this out eventually, to his credit, but you have to accept what the audience says. The audience says, we don't want that, we want this. You got to give them this. Otherwise, you got to go and retire, which is what basically Jonathan Frid did. And for decades afterwards, as far as I can see, he did nothing. He did one Oliver Stone horror movie. Before Oliver Stone established himself, he did a horror movie, and he wasn't playing the villain in that particular film, but it was nothing remarkable. I don't know if he might have done one TV show, an episode of a TV movie, it might have been. Other than that, he was gone from movies and television until he made that blink and you miss it appearance in Tim Burton's Dark Shadows.
Right.
Which I thought was really more sad than anything else. I have a feeling that if Jonathan Frid had known what that movie would turn out to be, I don't think he would have anything to do with it.
So
But,
was the was House of Dark Shadows, was it successful in the theaters when it
it
came out?
was, yes, it was a successful. The MGM was being run by a vicious criminal at the time. I forget his name. I had it. I wanted to mention it because I always try to give credit to all the vicious criminals.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was fairly notorious. He eventually ran CBS, and he ended up getting fired, I believe, because he was scheduling shows that he was involved in producing, which you're not supposed to do if you're the head of the network.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to favor your shows that you're producing. I don't think he's supposed to be producing shows at all. But anyway, he ended up, but he made a lot of money in his time, and he did manage to pull MGM out of the red. But the funny thing was, it might have been House of Dark Shadows that helped to do that, because it was a significant box office success. They spent about $800,000 on it, and they made a lot more than that when it was released.
So were like TV studios, ABC, were they not making movies back then? And that's why like a different studio would make it, or?
Well, Dan Curtis apparently owned the rights to Dark Shadows. And I imagine he must have mentioned to ABC, I know they had a company that made films that got some theatrical release. He might have mentioned it to them. But as I say, nobody thought you could do that. Nobody thought you could take a soap opera and turn it into a movie. So he ended up shopping it around until he found somebody that was willing to buy it. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it. What I should ask you, right? What did you think about it?
Like I said, the editing was that was the most. Like, some of the scenes, some of the cuts were like real jarring. I thought the story was good. Of course, I mean, acting wasn't the best, but I knew what I was, dealing with going into it. I'd seen it before. This was the first time I'd seen it.
Was that right?
It's been a while since I've seen it, but yeah, I think it's enjoyable for what it is.
Yeah, well, it's certainly rich with Gothic atmosphere.
Oh yeah.
The surprising thing to me, and I haven't seen this in any other review, a lot of people comment on how underlit it is, and it is ridiculously.
Yeah, it's kind of dark.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just an aesthetic choice; it's a mistake. They underlit the scene.
You don't think they were just trying to get away from the look?
Well, I'm sure that's true.
And then they went way too far with it.
They went way too far. But I think also they were shooting on location in this historic place, and apparently the interiors that they were shooting in were very cramped, very small. So they might not have had room for all the additional lighting equipment they needed. That leads to another problem. There isn't a single shot in this movie that's in sharp focus.
Right, yeah.
And that's something I've never seen in any movie. I mean, you can tell that this isn't in sharp focus, because even when they put it out in high definition and they restored it and they sharpened it, it still isn't sharp. Yeah. It's not wildly out of focus. It's just slightly out of focus. And sometimes the focus is just on the wrong part of the room, right? Like the things behind them might be in focus, but the stuff that's in the people themselves are not in focus. But there are some shots where nothing is in focus. Nothing is in sharp focus. I think that they did there's some imagery in it that's very impressive. It looks nice, but sharpness problem and the problem with the lighting, it all being too dark. Nowadays, that's a choice. And usually, when they do scenes that are very, very, very dark, they always make sure that the thing that's important to the audience, the thing that you need to see, is lit to some extent.
Right. Yeah.
But in this case, they frequently have scenes like that whole scene with Dr. Stokes, I guess his name is, when they go to the island. For some reason, they have to go to an island. I don't know why. And he gets into a fight with the guy, and it's almost black.
Yeah, you can't really see anything. Yeah.
There's nothing in it that's visible, clearly visible. Reminded me of the climactic battle in Dracula versus Frankenstein, where there was something that was shot. Like they grabbed the camera, ran out into the woods. They said, well, just shoot it with the natural light. Problem is, they were doing what they did in the House of Dark Shadows all the time, too. They shot day for night. And when you do that, you can't have your camera pointed towards the sky, because if you point the camera towards the sky, then all the figures in the shot will be, unless you have additional lighting, they'll all be in silhouette.
Yeah.
because the sky is always going to be the brightest thing in your shot if you're shooting during the day. It doesn't matter how much you try to darken it afterwards. As a matter of fact, it makes it worse because you darken the sky to make it look like night. That means your characters are going to be completely black. Anyway, they did a lot of day for night shooting in House of Dark Shadows. By the time they got to the second film, they had worked out these little problems. And the second film, even though it's even more incomprehensible than the first film, because same thing, MGM stepped in and said, we're giving you a day to take 20 minutes out of this movie. So it basically just get out the scissors and start cutting. And the movie makes no sense at all. It was completely rubbished by the studio. But in terms of the look of the film, it's beautiful looking. It's exactly, if you were doing a haunted house type thing, that's exactly the look you should go for. It's not like the phony shit that they do in the Burton movie where everything is done by, CGI or in front of a green screen. But yeah, the first film was successful at the box office, successful enough to warrant a sequel. Jonathan Frid declined to do Barnabas Collins again, and they did the second film with David Selby, who had established himself on the soap opera as Quentin Collins. Quentin was another one of the big characters on Dark Shadows. He came fairly late in the series. And I think he was originally meant to be a ghost, and then eventually with various variations in the storyline, it became a werewolf character. But David Selby was another one of those actors that had a very unusual facial structure, and he had a great presence. And he's a talented actor, and he's still acting. He's still doing TV shows and movies even to this day. So they've got him and Kate Jackson. Kate Jackson, her first acting experience was doing the soap opera Dark Shadows. And they made her and David Selby were the stars of Night of Dark Shadows. Grayson Hall was along playing a different character. And Willie Loomis, the Willie Loomis actor, John Collin, he was along playing a different character. And it's much worse than House of Dark Shadows, because even though it looks better, the story is nonsense, and it just doesn't work as a film. But that's worth watching, I suppose, just for the atmosphere and Anyway, it was a long time before they revisited Dark Shadows, and there was syndication issues because apparently, and this is all information I get, a lot of this information I learned from reading Danny Horn's daily blog about Dark Shadows, which was called Dark Shadows Every Day. That's one of the best blogs I've ever read about TVs and movies. It's just loaded with information. So I recommend that to anybody who's interested in Dark Shadows. Anyway, he was describing in one blog entry about Dark Shadows how the syndication problem, a problem with the syndication arose because apparently certain actors in TV shows, even soap operas, get residuals the first 3 times the show is aired. With most shows, they only have like 200 episodes for a whole run of the series because it's a weekly show, right? And it's only on for so many months in a year, a season. So you end up with shows that maybe have 200, 300 episodes, even the most successful series. With a soap opera, you have 2,000 episodes. And so they can't continue to pay the actors residuals every time another episode of a series that went on for 5 years, a daily series. They can't continue to pay the residuals. So what they did instead is they solved the problem by only taking 1 or 2 years, so many months. And it was only years later that PBS got involved. This is kind of a bizarre thing. Local PBS stations started to run Dark Shadows, and because the Dark Shadows fans were so fanatical, they started to donate their money to the PBS station, which gave them a justification for saying, well, if people are going to pay, right, if we're going to get these donations based on Dark Shadows, we'll buy more episodes. So that's what really brought more and more of the show into syndication. And now, of course, I think the Sci-Fi Channel ran a certain number of years of it for a while. It's been on just about every other streaming, Pluto TV and Tubi TV. Tubi TV is where I watched it fairly recently. They all have it, and I think Amazon has it as well. YouTube has it. Everybody
Right,
has
yeah.
it. So it went from being something that you could barely find to being something that is you can't get away from.
I guess PBS is probably where I would have first seen it at.
Yeah, that's during those lean years, that was about the only place that you could find it. And of course, it was a bit of a shock because when you're a kid in the 60s, you watch stuff like that, and it's sort of like being born into a religion. You know, you've been brought into this thing that you don't really understand, but people say, this is what you should like. You're a kid, you should like this. And then when you see it in the 80s and you're a little savvier, you know, a little more mature, you look at that and think, what did we say? What was it about this that we liked? But at the same time, there is a certain quality to an atmosphere to it. The sort of, and the video effect actually added to it. It felt like you had like a security camera into this crazy fucking world, you know? And the fact that it was all unedited and anything pretty much could happen gave it an immediacy, you know? So that's something you didn't see anywhere else. There was no other show that was anything like that, you know? So anyway, I forget the company, the video company, MCI, I think might have been. They put out all the things on VHS tapes. So if you were a Dark Shadows fan who had a lot of disposable income, you could buy this never-ending series of VHS tapes. They finally, I think, put it out in a box set that was shaped like a coffin, which I guess is kind of cute. And then in the 90s, they tried the primetime series with Ben Cross, and they covered the same story again. So that's 2 versions of the same story, 3 if you count House of Dark Shadows. And then they did the CW pilot. That's 4 versions of the same story. And then Tim Burton did his version. That's 5 versions of the same story. And yet none of them really were quite right.
Right, yeah.
They're all endearing and interesting in their own way, with possible exception of the Burton version. But I like the pilot, the unaired pilot for the WB. I didn't think that was that terrible.
Was it like a lot of younger characters?
Yes.
Younger.
I think that's the big mistake.
Yeah.
They got some handsome-looking British young guy with long hair who looks completely at ease and confident and completely we wouldn't expect. You know, that's not the way we want our Barnabas Collins.
I'm Barnabas Collins. My apologies for the hour, but I couldn't resist any longer.
You can't have somebody who looks like they're confident in themselves, because the lack of confidence, that insecurity, is an essential part of the character. That's why the audiences were attracted to him.
Yeah.
You don't see that so much in the movie because you don't really see that much of any of the characters in the House of Dark Shadows.
Yeah.
And when they did the primetime remake in the 90s, they got Ben Cross, who was a very, movie star looking type guy, tall and commanding. So he didn't have that element to him of being uncertain, which the 90s version was probably their best opportunity to do a really good version of this, maybe even more so than the Tim Burton movie. And it just didn't seem to work for some reason, It seems like in order to recapture the success and the popularity of the soap opera, it has to be done in the same way, that all of those aspects of it, the fact that it was shot on video and that it was done so quickly and it was done on soundstage, all of that is part of what makes it work.
Right, yeah.
Dark Shadows, the original soap opera, and this is one of the mistakes I think Tim Burton made, it avoided really referencing anything that was going on in the 60s. It was just sort of this self-contained world. Dan Curtis was smart enough to know not to start working in hippies and flower power and rock music and all that sort of thing.
Because it didn't work on Star Trek.
Didn't work on Star Trek either. Yeah, well, let's be honest. None of the guys that were making these TV shows were of that generation. And so anything they did along those lines, if they tried to appeal to that audience, it always looked phony and silly.
Yeah.
House of Dark Shadows, I suppose you could say that maybe some of the fashions that the women are wearing, like the mini skirts and things like that, that suggests the 70s.
But the
it's not-
music, I mean, they didn't use any modern music, so that, kind of helped it out a little bit.
every once in a while they'll go to the Blue Whale, the bar, and there'll be something that vaguely resembles popular music playing in the
Yeah.
but it's certainly not like what Tim Burton did in his
In
film.
his, yeah, I didn't realize till today when I was looking up information on it that Dick Smith had done the special effects for it.
Yes, he did the makeup effects for the soap opera as well.
What are you doing here, Carol?
Came to see Cousin Barnabas.
And now you see him.
But you can't be Barnabas.
But I am.
Yeah, it's very impressive in the TV show, and they did the same thing again for the movie.
Yeah. Now in the movie, to save money, he just used all the appliances came from Dustin Hoffman.
Right.
And Little Big Man.
I guess those prosthetics were easily substituted. Maybe his face was structurally similar to Dustin Hoffman's, but he's balder and he's more grotesque.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of the grandpa character from Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yes, it looks very much like that. Yes, that's one of the highlights of House of Dark Shadows, I guess, that sequence.
I don't know, I guess the all the death scenes at the end with everybody getting stabbed with a stake and
Caroline
real bloody.
Caroline being staked with all the police officers. That was a good scene, I thought. That might have been one of the scenes that upset the parents because
maybe.
That
Plus, it also made me realize the cross in vampire movies. Like I still don't understand it. I just never got that aspect of the vampire story.
Well, with our attitude about vampires now, we see them more as being human beings who have been changed in some way.
Right.
Vampires originally were considered spectral creatures, similar to ghosts. That's why they can do things like turn into vapor or turn into animals, or why they don't cast any reflection in the mirror, which is another thing that they have in House of Dark Shadows.
Yeah, I think they ripped that scene off for Fright Night.
Oh, really?
Or it might be the same scene whenever the Vincent character is standing there looking in he's got a little compact mirror and everybody's behind him and he notices that the guy's not casting the reflection.
Well, of course, the granddaddy of them all was the 1931 Dracula, where Dr. Van Helsing picks up a cigarette box that has a mirror in the lid. And that's one of the most dramatic scenes in that movie. I still think that has extraordinary power when Dracula knocks it out of his hand and glares at him. And then he sort of pulls himself together and said, I dislike mirrors.
Yeah.
Dr. Van Helsing will explain. And then he just turns and leaves. That's pretty powerful. I think that in this film, as far as dramatic power, the scene that had the most potential was the scene where Julia goes to the old house and sort of tells Barnabas, makes her offer to Barnabas. I know what you are, and I think I can cure you.
I can change you. I can make you a normal human being.
And that had the potential of being a very dramatic scene, and it's not a bad scene in this film. It's probably one of the better scenes in the film. But the problem was that Dan Curtis was really keen on getting away from the sort of stagey feel of soap operas. And so he wasn't really shooting the thing in a way that would allow the actors to really give the most dynamic performance. And also, I assume the editing probably whittled that scene down.
Yeah.
Because in the soap opera, I have to say, there was a similar scene in the soap opera, and that's one of the highlights of the series. They managed to stage it in such a way so that Dr. Hoffman seems like a real important person in this story now. Suddenly, she's smart. She's got something going on in her head, which is something that's always absent from the other characters. Like the woman that the story was originally supposed to be about, Victoria Winters. She's the governess that comes. She comes on the train and she arrives at Collinsport. She doesn't seem to have a brain in her head. She doesn't have a thought in her head. Whatever anybody suggests, that's what she goes along with. She doesn't make a fuss. You don't get any impression that there's any sort of interior dialogue or monologue going on in her head. And so she's not interesting to watch as a character. Barnabas, you do get that feeling. Of course you would, because he's got all this secret stuff. He's a vampire, right? He's got all this stuff he's trying to hide.
Now they had some weird vampire lore too, with the shoot him in the heart with a silver bullet would kill him. They probably should have stuck with what everybody knows, the stake in the heart and all that.
Yeah, and it doesn't really make sense in House of Dark Shadows that they introduce the silver bullet thing, because the cops end up using stakes and crosses.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they have that whole scene of them just handing out, getting everybody a gun and a handful of bullets, and
that's another problem. Nobody in a vampire story like this there should never be any sort of societal recognition that vampires exist. It should always be something that only a few people know, because you want to, at some point, get those few people who are in the know. You want to be able to get them on their own quest to destroy the vampire, right? If everybody in society knows that such things exist, and you can just call the local police chief and say, have your men come over with their stakes, I got a vampire for you to kill. I mean, one of you could sort of see maybe over the course of the soap opera, how the law enforcement, when it would put in an appearance, they were constantly questioning, and there was always I mean, the thing that occurs to me is that if I was a law enforcement person and somebody said, that guy's a vampire, I would say, well, maybe he thinks he's a vampire.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why he's behaving the way he's behaving. But you wouldn't necessarily buy into all the supernatural stuff, right? That would be unusual for somebody in law enforcement. They tend to be kind of skeptical people generally. A good thing, I would guess. But yeah, I mean, at the end, I guess Roger, is it Roger? No, it's not Roger, it's Jeff, who is the boyfriend, the sort of bland, nondescript boyfriend of Maggie. He shoots Dr. Stokes several times with the silver bullet gun. That's how he dispatches him. But we can't. We only know that because we hear the sound of the gun. We can't actually see it because it's too fucking dark. But they make sure that he discharges all the bullets in the gun on Dr. Stokes, because they want to set up that he needs to find another weapon to kill Roger when he wakes up. That was all handled rather awkwardly, and I think it shows the budget issues. They really couldn't do. They wanted to save the big spectacular ending for Barnabas for his death, so the other deaths are done in sort of, shoot it in a couple of hours and get it over with type thing. I don't think that even the Barnabas's death was staged very well, to be honest. They had a nicer set. But that's the other thing that's kind of confusing. In the story, even in this movie, the way it's explained to us, there's Collinwood, the new house where everybody's living, and then there's the old house, which is in a state of decay, that Barnabas moves into, and he fixes it up a little bit. That's part of the plot of the movie, right? So at a certain point, the old house doesn't look like an abandoned house anymore. It looks like a nice house. Matter of fact, some of the characters even comment, Julia comments on, oh, you've done wonderful things with the place. I don't know how well he managed to rebuild the whole fucking mansion. But the same problem with the soap opera is kind of hard to figure out. That he got, all we ever see him with is some paint. Somehow he's rebuilt the whole fucking place. But in the House of Dark Shadows, we end up on that island where there apparently is some other derelict building. And that's confusing. It probably is made even more confusing by the editing, because we're just there,
Yeah, because it feels like what happened? Did the house go back to a disarray that quick?
And the old house never looked as bad as that house. I guess it's supposed to be a chapel at the very end. They're in a chapel in some old derelict building. But that sort of reminded me of the mansion that pops up on an island in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Just there, But the staging of that showed that they were probably rushing to get the thing done, because some of it is rather sloppily done. We see Willie jumping to stop Barnabas from. It's hard to really even explain. Barnabas is going to marry her. Okay. How's he marry her? He marries her by biting her, but he's already bitten her. He's already bitten her several times. So what exactly is going on here? Well, we don't know. But whatever he's doing, Willie decides he doesn't like it. After suffering with Barnabas's craziness for the whole movie, he suddenly decides he's going to try to stop this wedding procedure, whatever it is. And so he picks the moment just when Jeff is firing his crossbow, and he gets between Barnabas and the crossbow, and he gets the bolt in his back. And the bolt looks like the leg of a chair. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
That's a real medieval piece of equipment he was using. So that kills Willie. And then I guess at some point, Barnabas pulls the bolt out of Willie's back and is going to use it on Jeff. And Barnabas suddenly develops the ability to command people using his mental power, also calling out his name, but calling him by the name that we don't know him by in the movie.
Yeah.
His name in the movie, everybody refers to him as Jeff, and in the Barnabas is referring to him by his last name. I don't even remember what it was. So that doesn't make sense. It makes the ending that much more confusing. And then he, I guess, tosses, not a smart thing for a vampire to do. He tosses the bolt, the crossbow bolt away, and asks Jeff to be the witness at the ceremony. Willie manages to get up and picks up the bolt and sticks it in Barnabas's back. He gives the first blow, and then Jeff sticks it a couple of times just to make sure, to make sure he got the message.
Yeah, because I was like, that's kind of weird the way they done that.
Well, they wanted everybody to take part.
Oh yeah.
In spite of all these criticisms that one might have, the fact that it's too dark, the fact that it's been absurdly edited into a mess, and despite the fact that it's frequently out of focus, and despite the fact that there are all these lapses of logic in the story, as far as we can tell what the story is, there are lapses of logic and continuity. But in spite of all of that, I have much greater affection for this film than I do for Tim Burton's film.
Yeah, that's what I was going to move into, the Tim Burton film. I'd never seen it before until today.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I just never had any interest in it. And then I watched it today.
What was your feelings?
I didn't really enjoy it.
Oh.
I thought it was, to me, it was, like, I don't know the guy that wrote it. I was thinking maybe Tim Burton wrote it, but he didn't.
No, they hired someone on the screenwriter. I think it's the guy who wrote Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Oh, okay.
I think so. I'm not sure.
But I just think if Tim Burton was a fan, or if the guy that wrote it was a fan, this was definitely the wrong type of movie to, you know what I'm saying? Because it's almost like they were saying, well, it was a cheesy soap opera, so let's just make a cheesy, when they could have really done a dark movie, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I don't know why they decided to go full on comedy with it.
Well, Dan Curtis, to his credit, and Dan Curtis is the guy that produced and created the original show. He was a very unusual person to be doing this, because from what I understand, he was a big, aggressive, macho man. He was somebody that really struck fear into the hearts of the people that worked with him. With that sort of macho man attitude, somebody who comes from sports programming, to end up doing stuff like gothic romance type stuff, it's really quite, very unusual and surprising. And what's even more surprising is he had a real feel for it.
Yeah.
He wasn't certainly not an adept director. He has some very dynamic angles in some of those shots that he set up. He's shooting through things and past things to give some feeling of depth to the shots and to create a more dramatic feel to the movie. So that's all to his credit. Now, one thing I think is particularly important, it would have been very easy for him to turn it into a joke. You know? And he never did. He always played it dead straight all the time. There's hardly any humor in any Dark Shadows. I don't remember any humor in Dark Shadows. All the years of the soap opera, the only humor was unintentional. But he always played it straight. And that's the reason the show has always been so beloved, because it is a real world in a sense, it's a self-contained world, and you don't feel like they're making fun of you for liking it and for being interested in it. The things that they say are consequential, they expect you to believe it's consequential, and they're not going to mock you for taking it seriously. But in the case of the Tim Burton movie, in the case of a lot of other horror films that are done in a spoofy kind of way, they're in a sense making fun of their audience for taking
Yeah.
it kind of seriously. I wouldn't mind it being turned into a comedy if the jokes were funny. But I have here
Yeah, the
one of the paperbacks. Did I show you this? This was one of the this was a bestseller, believe it or not. Barnabas Collins in a Funny Vein. This came out in 1969, it looks like. I don't have my glasses now. 1968 or 1969. Here's the level of wit that you get from Barnabas Collins. Barnabas Collins likes his part as a vampire. He says, "This is a part I can sink my teeth into. I also thought the show needed some new blood. I knew this would be my golden opportunity. This has the possibility of being a fantastic show." Can you believe it? And they were selling this only, it looks like 50 cents. So I guess it's not major.
Right.
This isn't that far from the humor in the Tim Burton movie.
Yeah,
It's
no.
almost like the screenwriter said, "Oh, I got to use that. That's a good one." I don't understand why people would think that these corny old gags. I mean, I sent to you that that episode of the Red Skelton show from the 50s, right? With Bela Lugosi, actually Bela Lugosi, and Vampira, playing sort of a monster show sketch with Red Skelton. And it was actually pretty good. It was actually pretty well played.
Say, didn't I meet you in a hardware store trying on brooms?
We're wasting our precious time. I have to prepare the laboratory. Oh, it's so wonderful a night for an operation. The moon is full.
Here, stop that. That ain't a real moon. Sam put that up there.
But to be doing in 2012 the same jokes that Red Skelton was doing on TV in 1957 or so, I mean, that's just sad. Here's another mistake that they made. And maybe they were thinking of Francis Coppola's version of Dracula. You know how Francis Coppola's version of Dracula starts with that little introduction to the story, telling about Vlad the Impaler, which is very nicely done. But at the same time, it's not too detailed and it's not too explicit so that we don't feel like we're getting like a coming attractions or a trailer. Tim Burton's Dark Shadows, they start the movie with this, I don't know how long it is, it feels like it's 20 minutes.
Yeah, no.
Of who Barnabas Collins was and who his family was and how, and who Angelique was and how she got angry at him and decided to put a curse on the woman he was going to marry so that she jumped off a cliff. And then Barnabas tried to jump off a cliff too, but she put out the whammy on him. And so when he landed, he realized he was a vampire. And then he ends up being put into a coffin by his father and blah, 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 blah. This all happens at the beginning of the movie. And what they do is they've now told us all the stuff that we need to know about this movie. We could go home.
Yeah.
And as far as I was concerned, that was, I don't think you can recover from that.
No.
If you give away all the magic in the first few minutes of the movie, you know, you're finished. And the rest of the stuff is like, why are we here? I mean, we've already seen this pretty remarkable story about guys being turned into vampires and people jumping off cliffs, and blah, blah, witches and people being entombed in coffins. And then we're supposed to take an interest in some woman going to some decrepit old house.
Right.
That's supposed to be intriguing to us. Why would it be? You know?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit too much of just the Barnabas character. You didn't care about the other characters. At the end, when he gets together with the girl, I'm just like, I don't care.
Yeah, at that point, I was only watching with one eye, to be honest. I had one eye on my smartphone at that point, you know.
Yeah, because they had too many like musical montage scenes of getting the factory built back up and
that was
the
terrible.
house. It's like, oh
Wasn't
my
that
god.
And all that stuff with the different factories and all that, it was just like he was still doing Charlie and the Chocolate
Factory, yeah.
And the fact that they have Barnabas made up to look so absurd. When I first saw the photos, I thought, well, that must be that they put his blue on his face because they're going to do something in CGI afterwards, or no, that's the way he actually looks in the movie. You know, and right away you say, well, how could anybody, accept that. They see a guy who looks like that come into their home, and we're supposed to believe that they would accept that he's some cousin from England. Ridiculous. One of the things I think I would say about Dark Shadows as a whole is that potential is more important than the actual programs themselves. When the audience watched the show, they were always thinking, when they watched the original TV soap opera, they were thinking, this is going to get good. Look at how it's going. Eventually, this is going to be good, And they would talk among their friends, just as people do now, about TV shows, streaming series and whatnot. Oh, did you see what happened last episode? Oh, this is going to, because nothing really ever important or significant happens on any of these shows. But it's the feeling that something might. There's the potential there. And that's what people were hoping. They were thinking, finally, somebody has the resources to really do this in an intelligent, respectful way to realize the potential of this story. Yeah. It's not great literature. It's not great television. It's not great anything. Never was. But here's a chance to make it something great. And instead you do this trauma film. Fairly recently, within the past decade or so, S.E. Hinton?
Mm-hmm.
S.E. Hinton was I guess she originated the young adult market. She did The Outsiders and Rumblefish and I guess a couple others that were very popular young adult novels. They hired her. I don't know if it was Paperback Library or some other publisher that's doing Dark Shadows books now. They commissioned her to write a Dark Shadows book. And she did. And when they read it, they said, oh, no. Too much. I don't know if she was dealing with sexual stuff. Presumably that was what bothered them. But they said, we can't publish this as a Dark Shadows book. I guess they were afraid it would hurt their franchise. So you know what she did? She changed the names and she put it out as a room book. And so now there's a book out there called Hawks Harbor by S.E. Hinton. She put it out under her own name. And when you read it, it's basically Dark Shadows.
Really?
It's told from the point of view of Willie Loomis. And it's available on the Open Library, on the Internet Archive, if anybody wants to take a peek at it. But I think that shows if somebody of her stature, and I think she's a pretty good writer of the type of fiction she does, somebody of her stature says, yeah, I'll do a Dark Shadows book. There's something there.
Yeah.
And she's actually able to turn it into a pretty good book because the book got decent reviews. I don't know if all the reviewers were aware that it was previously a Dark Shadows book, but if somebody of that stature sees potential in that story, in certain elements of that story, then that means that there is potential there. Somebody who's clever enough and willing to put the time and thought into it can come up with something that would be compelling.
Now, do you recommend any younger people go back and try to watch the old soap opera or the movies?
Well, I suppose there's going to be some young people that are going to be going back and watching it no matter what. And there's a certain core group of fans for Dark Shadows that are far more fanatical than I have ever been. I mean, I remember even when I was a kid, the show sometimes felt more like an obligation than something I was really enjoying.
Yeah.
Because it had a lot of, old people talking to each other, which was not something that a 5-year-old kid really necessarily. You want to see vampires and werewolves. Right. And if you didn't happen to catch the particular episode that the vampire bared his fangs in, and you were stuck listening to Joan Bennett, do this business with her hands. So I never was a wild fanatic, but I have to admit, when I was watching it on Tubi TV, I downloaded the app to my smart TV, and it allowed, I don't know if they still allow this, but they allowed you to skip through the commercials.
Right.
And they also allowed you to fast forward to the show itself. So it made it much easier to cover a lot of ground as soon as you saw one of those boring conversation stories. That is probably the best way to watch it, if that's still possible. I think it's still on Tubi TV. I don't know if they're loading.
Yeah, I was watching. That's where I was watching that yesterday.
How's the commercial situation there? Is it?
It didn't seem too bad. I've seen worse. I've been in some apps where you're getting an ad break every 2 minutes.
Yeah. How much of the soap opera did you watch? Just a couple of.
Just a couple of the episodes. Like I said, I remember watching it when I was younger, but I don't think I went back that far because I didn't remember it being in black and white. So I started with that very first episode yesterday and watched 2 of them, and then watched the movies today. And I was really relieved that I didn't have to pay for the Tim Burton movie.
Yeah, you don't want to have to pay for that.
No.
Dark Shadows, the soap opera, might have been one of the first soap operas, might have been the first soap opera to go to color. I don't know if there was any other color soap operas on at that time. And I guess they thought it was a natural thing because it's about spooky stuff and atmospheric sets and whatnot, so it looked good in color. But yeah, so it doesn't, when you watch it now, I think I prefer the black and white to the color.
Yeah.
Color was kind of crappy looking back at that time.
Yeah, when I was watching the first episode, I kind of felt like it looked like something filmed today that was just turned black and white to make it look old. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it didn't feel like it was filmed in the. It didn't feel like it was filmed in the '60s.
Yeah, it was. Well, some of the episodes only survive as kinescopes. They were. You basically point a film camera at a monitor and film. I think all unusual for a soap opera, all the episodes of Dark Shadows exist in some form. They're either kinescopes or videotapes. They have one episode that's missing the image. They only have the audio, but everything else is intact, which is pretty amazing when you stop and think about it.
Yeah.
And soap operas are kind of like talk shows and news shows that they're not things that people think they should be hanging on to.
Yeah, save all this film because we're going to be selling tapes of it later. They weren't thinking about that.
So, but somebody must have been thinking maybe this has some potential as a syndicated thing, and eventually it did.
Now, it's not the longest running show, right?
No, not by any means. I mean,
Okay.
soap operas actually have amazingly long lives. There are some soap operas that go on for decades.
Yeah. I know some of the All My Children and stuff's been on since that time. But
they might some of them started in radio. So,
yeah.
endless. I used to dislike soap operas as a form. I always thought it was kind of tedious, but I have a certain admiration for what they do. The idea of doing a show every day. That's
you got to give them props for that. Now, I don't watch these other, but I've had relatives that would watch them, and of course, if they're watching, you're there. You're obviously seeing some of it, and I've seen some crazy shit on there, like exorcisms and stuff. And I'm just like, that's out there. So not too different than, I guess, darker.
Well, you have to wonder if maybe from time to time they think, hey, why don't that Dark Shadow show, that was pretty successful. Why don't we try that on this?
Why don't we have a vampire for 2 weeks?
What the hell?
If it doesn't work, we'll just write them out and never speak of it again. Everybody that I know my age, they either going to watch it or not. But anybody younger than me, they're not going to. I can't imagine them sitting down and watching hours and hours and hours of this show.
Well, wouldn't you say it's similar to Doctor Who in a way? You're a Doctor Who.
Oh, yeah.
In a way, it's the sort of thing that's the appeal of it is kind of hard to explain. When the people who are its audience, the people who are its potential audience, once they hear about it, they know whether it's for them, right?
Right, yeah.
You hear about the premise of Doctor Who, and right away you know that's for me.
Yeah.
And
it's just that show though, you got the newer ones. Yeah, that's like easier to get people to watch that. Where I'm not going to tell anybody to watch the Tim Burton movie. So
I don't think unless I really dislike the person.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it's an interesting phenomenon. Cultural phenomenon, sort of similar to Star Trek in the history of TV of the 60s, that something like this would catch on and become an ongoing thing. And I don't know if I could explain it. And I don't know, I know that it doesn't appeal to everyone. And I can't really say it's quality stuff, but it does have something about it. Cleveland Amory, I think it was the critic for TV Guide. Do you remember TV Guide?
Yeah.
Cleveland Amory is a guy that would write reviews for TV Guide. And he said that he was a very curmudgeon-y fellow. He said he watched Dark Shadows when it was originally running. He watched it for a week, and he thought it was one of the worst things he'd ever seen on television. But he said when Saturday came and it wasn't on, he missed it.
Yeah.
And I think that sums up the whole thing. It was that sort of feeling of people who are trying to do something with nothing. And yeah, it can't help but be endearing to, to the audience.
All right. Well,
But,
this was a fun episode. And until next week, we will continue to watch the good, the bad, and the cheaply made.
Take care.
Dark Shadows has been a Dan Curtis production.